Today we're going to do a genetics lesson with itslearning. So the first thing you need to do is you need to open up your browser to where you see the toggles for HCPS. You'll then click on itslearning, which will bring up the field that your student will see as they go on to itslearning. Now today we're going to be working through biology. So I will just click on biology, which will open up what your students will see as they go into the course. Today we're going to go under resources, which is a really great place for teachers to put lots of really important resources. As you click on resources, what you will see are the files that your students are able to access. Teachers will use this place a lot for students to get access to extra work, extra practice, and little tutorials, which we're going to be doing today. Today we're going to be doing a tutorial about Punnett squares. So I'm going to click on Punnett square tutorial, which will open up a page. These pages are great for teachers to create lots of resources within one spot, so your students aren't moving from spot to spot on the website. Now, as you can see here, this page is asking for a pre-assessment. A lot of times pre-assessments are really good to kind of see where we're at as we start a lesson, and then as you can see at the end of the lesson, we have a post-assessment to see if any growth was made while we went through the activity. So today, let's just say, I'm doing okay, but I need more practice, and vote. The great thing about this is it doesn't show other people's answers, it just shows me what you put down there. The teacher is the one that is going to get the information, and we can use that for lots of different reasons, so it's awesome. Today, we have a Punnett square flip chart for the tutorial. And as you can see here, as I click on this link, it has downloaded right down here in this corner. And as soon as it finishes downloading, we're going to open that up, click on the software, and we're good to go. So our objective is to make sure you are feeling really confident with Punnett squares before the tutorial is over today. Now, Punnett squares have lots of vocabulary, and your kids, I'm sure, have been coming home talking about homozygous and heterozygous and dominant and recessive. So we're going to review these topics before we go into the Punnett squares just to make sure we're all feeling really good with that vocabulary, because that is key. So, an allele. What's an allele? So let's talk about alleles. Alleles, you get one from each parent, and each of those alleles make up a genotype. So this genotype is combined of two alleles. Now, we represent those alleles by letters. So you're going to have what I would say a dominant allele, and you're going to have a recessive allele. Now, your kids might be very tempted to say big B, little b. Please reinforce their vocabulary of dominant and recessive. If you're using dominant recessive, they're using dominant recessive, I'm using dominant recessive, everybody is going to be constantly using the vocabulary needed, which is awesome for the science language. So when we're talking about a genotype, we're talking about homozygous dominant, heterozygous dominant, and homozygous recessive. Now, we're talking about homozygous dominant. That means there's two dominant alleles. Heterozygous means there's one of each allele, one dominant, one recessive. Homozygous recessive, that means there's two recessive alleles. These are the only possible genotypes that we're going to be discussing today. There are more, but we're not ready for that yet. Phenotype. Phenotype are the physical characteristics. So when I talk to the kid, it's what you see. Genotype, like we just said, are the letters, the alleles, the genetic makeup. Homozygous, heterozygous, homozygous recessive. Tall plant, short plant. Those would be the phenotypes. Again, these are our genotypes. Okay? So let's put this to some practice real quick before we move on. So if I'm looking at this trait, the trait that I'm looking at is eye color. So the dominant eye color, we can see, would be green. The recessive eye color would be red. So if I have a genotype, homozygous dominant, two dominant alleles, what possibly would my phenotype be? So when we're looking at genotype and phenotype, you can determine a phenotype just by looking at the genotype. So the dominant allele is dominant for a reason. It tends to be a little bit more bold, a little bit more loud, where the recessive seems to be a little bit more timid. So I always tell my kids, whenever you see a dominant allele, it overshadows that poor little recessive who's like, ooh, don't look at me. So our phenotype here, if we only have dominant alleles, would be what? Green, okay? What if we had both? Now this always gets the kids, oh, well it must be one green and one red. Well, we don't have one green and one red eye. So if you have that dominant and recessive allele, that's heterozygous, the phenotype will be what? So when you look at it, your dominant will overshadow your recessive allele. So it actually shows green. Dominant overshadows the recessive. Now, kids always love this one. We have a genotype of homozygous recessive. Remember, 2 recessive alleles. So there is no dominant trait there, and I always tell them the recessive alleles get excited because no dominant allele is overshadowing them. So it gives their phenotype a chance to express itself. So you have that recessive allele. So when you have red eye and you have green eyes, the possible genotypes would be heterozygous, homozygous dominant for green eye, or red eye would be homozygous recessive. These are key to being able to do Punnett squares. If your children are struggling with this, make sure they go back and they do more review with their vocabulary. Vocabulary is absolutely necessary to do Punnett squares. So, what would the genotype be for an individual who's heterozygous? If we've got brown eyes and blue eyes, heterozygous. What would the phenotype of an individual who is heterozygous be? Well, your allele should be 1 dominant and 1 recessive, and brown eyes. If a person has blue eyes, what would their genotype be? We have blue eyes. The only possible answer would be homozygous recessive. Hopefully you guys got that right. So now that we've got a good understanding of our genetics vocabulary, it's time to practice with Punnett squares. So if you have a piece of paper, it'd probably be a really good idea to grab that now so you can jot down some notes while we go through. Punnett squares, I always tell my kids, are like a puzzle. They're really, really fun to look through and figure out the answer. So the first thing you do, the kids love this, you draw a little window. 4 boxes, and then you have 2 parent genotypes. Remember, genotypes are the alleles. So you have a parent 1 genotype and you have parent 2 genotype. It does not matter where they go on the box as long as they stay together. So we've got homozygous recessive, heterozygous. So when you go through, it's kind of like, I always tell the kids, like a multiplication table. So you pull it down, pull it over, pull it down, pull it over, down, pull it over, down, and pull it over. So as the alleles match in the squares is where they go. Let's do that together. Down, over. So these are your possible out of 100%. Each box equals 25%. So if we're talking about plants, the dominant trait would be tall, the recessive trait would be short. Now let me show you how to analyze. So if we're thinking genotypes, you've got how many heterozygous? Well, we've got 2 of these out of 4 that are heterozygous, which would be what percent out of 100? 50. You've got 2 out of 4 that are homozygous recessive. And again, that would be 50%. So that's our genotypes. But what about our phenotypes? So let's take a look at each one of these. And remember, you've got 2 here that have a dominant allele. You've got 2 out of 4 that are homozygous recessive. So you look at that as you go through with your physical appearance, your phenotype. Tall, what percent is tall? 2 have the dominant allele. So 2 out of 4 would be 50%, and 2 out of 4 would be short, 50%. I know that seems like a lot. That's why practice is key when we're talking about Punnett squares. So let's do that. If I have parents, one parent is homozygous dominant, and one parent is homozygous recessive. So if we were to pull down and pull over, pull down and pull over, pull down, pull over, pull down, and pull over. That is our Punnett square. So hopefully that matches what you've done on your paper. When we look at it, the phenotype possibilities would be tall or short. Those are the traits. So let's take a look at our genotype. Ooh. All right, so our genotype, 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember, if you think of it in terms of boxes, it goes quite well. 1, 2, 3, 4 are what genotype? They're heterozygous. So 4 out of 4 heterozygous, 100%. Boom. So let's look at our phenotype. All phenotypes, 1, 2, 3, 4, have the dominant allele. So if the dominant allele is present, it would then be the dominant phenotype. 4 out of 4, tall. Practice makes perfect. So if everyone has the dominant trait, and again, this is the part where the kids go, oh, I can do that in my head. Don't be tempted, because not a good idea. It's always good to continue to practice even though it looks like it's an easy one. But once the easy ones are done, it makes the analysis much quicker. Genotype, 4 out of 4, homozygous dominant, 100%. Phenotype, 4 out of 4, and again, we're dealing with tall as the dominant, 4 out of 4, dominant. This one is one of my favorites because you think, ooh, this is a little bit more tricky than what we've been dealing with. So, when we get to the Punnett square, pull over, now, one of the biggest things is your dominants may never go behind the recessives. If you notice, I'm always putting the recessives on this side. Again, remember, the recessive's shy, and if there's a dominant around, it likes to be big, bold, and loud. So let's take a look at this. Homozygous dominant, heterozygous, heterozygous, homozygous recessive. So we have 1 out of the 4 homozygous dominant, 2 out of 4 heterozygous, and 1 out of 4 homozygous recessive. Phenotypes. Take a look at those dominants, and you have 1 homozygous recessive, which means something really cool. Even though you've got different numbers here, it's okay if your phenotype doesn't look exactly the same. So when you look at it, you've got 3/4 are blue. These 3 have the dominant allele, whereas 1/4 is green, 25%. And we'll do one last one, just to make sure everybody's feeling good. Over, down, over, down. Yes, you can talk to yourself as you do the Punnett squares, completely normal. When you look at this Punnett square, you've got 2 homozygous dominant, 2 heterozygous, and you write that down with your genotype. 2/4 homozygous dominant, 50%. 2/4 heterozygous, 50%. Now, phenotype. They all have a dominant, So that should give you a real quick analysis that 4 out of 4 are going to be green. Now, hopefully, after completing the Punnett squares, you understand why that vocabulary is so important. Because if you can walk through the Punnett square and speak the language, and your students can speak the language, it makes the whole conversation scientific. It's fantastic. So, as you can go through, the best thing you need to do is practice and have fun. And if the kids are struggling, continue with the practice. On It's Learning, we had another activity which you do. So you go ahead and complete the post-assessment. I personally feel like that helped me a good bit. And we go through, go back to your resources, and if you can see, a lot of teachers will place extra practice. Here on the resource page, I have an extra practice assignment for my students. So when they pull this up, there's an extra tutorial. Khan Academy is a fantastic resource for math, science, anything extra that you might need. So I put 2 Khan Academy activities up here. Quizlet. Quizlet is awesome. If you get the app, Quizlet will talk you through your vocabulary. And on the phone, it's like a perfect flashcard size. So you just tap. So you have the definition on one side and you have the vocabulary word on the other. It's an awesome resource, especially if you're going to practice or sports or a long road trip. It's right there in your hand. You don't need anything but that. And I also put a little practice because writing them out is always good when we're talking about Punnett squares. When you're finished, always go back to home. You can log off, and that's it. Thanks for joining us today.